Monsieur le Président,
So, Madam President of the Law Commission of the National Assembly, President of the Commission of Laws of the Senate, Secretary General of the OECD, First Vice President of Senate, ladies and gentlemen, presidents of respective commissions and ministers, ladies and gentlemen, MPs of the member states of the EU, Director General of Internal Affairs of the EU concerning migratory issues, good morning. So, I wish a warm welcome here at the French Republic's Senate. We're delighted to welcome this new opportunity to talk together about parliamentary democracy across Europe, which manifests the contribution made by national states. We are, the crux of proximity democracy, with lending a ready ear to our citizens. Recommendations, proposals for Europe have been made. So it's very important to focus on our concerns of the greatest and closest interests of our European societies. Among these concerns, and this is a red thread, we see migratory matters looming large. In December last, I went to Greece, on the island of Chios, a few miles away from the Turkish coast, and in Lithuania, to the border with Belarus. It's important to say here before you, all dear colleagues, that I was very much impressed by the answer mobilized by the Greek and Lithuanian authorities faced with the migratory matters. Greece and Lithuania, helped by the EU institutions, in particular Frontex, managed to stem the migratory flows effectively, but also with dignity. Now, there's a collective desire to show how the EU is faithful to its mission when protecting human life. And of course, my thoughts go to the war in Ukraine. More than 5 million Ukrainians have been welcomed into our member states, in border states, bordering, of course, Ukraine. And we can pay tribute to Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, in particular, who did the best they could to offer dignified conditions of welcome to these Ukrainians fleeing their country. Now, there are many states among our members, and it's not an exhaustive list, of course, the Czech Republic and the Baltic states, who took over from these border states, showing massive mutual support to these immediately bordering states to Ukraine. Mutual support shown among our local authorities as well, it must be said. That mutual support was exemplary. Since 2015, the migratory crisis seen in the EU, and the EU wasn't ready for it then. And I draw, in respect of that, two lessons which show how far we've come and what progress we've made in abiding by our overriding principles, the national responses in connection with European institutions. I talked about Frontex a moment ago, bear witness to our ability to stem migratory flows when political will is where it should be. And this, abiding by the values enshrined by Europe, without showing any naivety or weakness. There is an imminent danger. An imminent danger here. Europe is not a fortress, lending a deaf ear to the miseries of the world. This is what some people say that it does. We remain faithful to our tradition of welcoming people and showing values of mankind and humanity. So it's up to us throughout this conference to define the appropriate means to improve a European answer to these migratory flows. Your conference is very topical, and particularly so now, since we're talking about the European Pact on immigration and asylum. This has always been pushed back in time. And so it's very important that this happens now and makes progress. Let me now refer you to one or two avenues of work that we may wish to embark upon. Understanding the geopolitical underlying of migratory flows should always prevail. Too many people have been instrumentalized. Migration can be used as a pressure point, blackmail by unscrupulous states who wish to use these displacements to send them into the European territories. So we need to, of course, respond to an imperative, a humanitarian imperative. But so these states run foul of our principles. Human trafficking, for example, doesn't only flow from organized crime. We also see states getting involved in these practices. And Belarus has shown its complicitousness over the last year. Second avenue, reinforcing Frontex since 2015 crisis. This was the most fruitious efforts brought to bear by the EU. I pay tribute to Mr. Fabrice Leggeri, for example, and to his team. Frontex turned into a major operational and effective partner. I'd like to pay tribute to its work. Frontex has shown its ability and the EU's ability to tailor to the extent, in conjunction with the national authorities, without substituting to them, offering logistic support where necessary, marshalling other member states' efforts, facilitating cooperation. At the end of the day, providing an answer which is genuinely European. Let me remind you, in the offing of our debate, the Frontex is not designed to patrol arrests of migrants, for example. Let's not weaken a tool that has helped the EU surmount some migratory issues since 2015. Third avenue, asylum is a right and an obligation, which is part and parcel of our common values. However, there is no absolute right to migrate, and any obligation to receive these people. Sometimes this is lost sight of, but it's very important to remember. Now, faced with illegal migration, we need to grapple with this matter. The corollary of Schengen are solid external borders to the European area. And when it's crucial, absolutely crucial, we need to turn these barriers into physical barriers, as some member states have decided to do so. But this is not to a source of aggression or violence. The European Court of Rights, in its ruling of 2020, ruled that a member state, Spain in that instance, hadn't committed an infraction in respect to the European Convention on Human Rights by sending migrants away who were crossing into their territory, because the migrants had deliberately chosen to cross the border unlawfully. Ladies and gentlemen, European solidarity is often referred to in order to pit European members one against the other. Some EU states come under migratory pressure. There's also the destination countries, states that favor obligatory receipt, but there are some who receive other contributions. Solidarity, however, should, in my view, start with looking in soul-searching, about thinking about how we address ourselves to permits, look at litigation use its courts or its administrative services appropriately. And this is the role of national parliaments, dear colleagues, to monitor governmental action in this realm and to make proposals thereto. The Law Committee at the Senate, under Mr. Buffet, has just published, this was only last week, a report entitled Immigration and State Services. Its conclusions are striking about where migration stands in France. But experience brings the proof every day. Time wasting, over complicated administrative services, negligences and omissions sometimes affect all our member states. And from a personal note, I would add that they're not worthy when you think about those who wish to migrate lawfully. Sending people back over a border, of course, going around a border, circumventing rules has a shock effect and snowball effect on others that may therefore fuel the flames of menu-based migrations. We'll have an opportunity of looking at how we can address this. But I think we now need to set up a mechanism of mutual recognition of decisions taken by member states to refuse access to asylum status in order to pick up on what is called this practice. Systematically, this needs to be made recourse to, re-access visas that should help a third country for returns. And we need to draw the relevant lessons from that for granting visas to get into the EU space. One sole objective: to address these returns and these appeals that may sap the authority of the state and the EU as a whole. So that's what I wanted to say. I want to be very blunt and full and frank. You who represent national parliaments in the EU, you have an opportunity, it strikes me, of offering an ambitious and demanding contribution to the ongoing discussions about this pact. Look at how far we've come since 2015. Let's be lucid, bear top of mind our values. That's crucial. But also, let's address ourselves to standing up to the plate. We're looking forward to hearing from you, and you're committed by what you say. Have a lovely session today, 2 sessions for dialogue and exchange. And let me now hand over to the President of the Law Committee at the Senate. Welcome to the Senate.
Monsieur le Président. Merci. Monsieur le Président du Sénat.
President of the Senate, President, Vice President of the Senate, President of the Committee of the Laws of the National Assembly, Madam Minister will be joining me in just a moment, Secretary General of the OECD, Director General of the General Directorate of Migrations at the European Commission, dear colleagues, dear MPs. It's quite obviously a delight and a great honor for me and the Committee of the Laws at the Senate, in conjunction with my colleague from the National Assembly, to welcome you here today to the Luxembourg Palace, and physically, the very first time, for our first meeting of national committees devoting, in the instance, to migratory challenges, and here in this wonderful room, which is an additional pleasure. Now, this conference, its topic had been decided upon well before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But obviously, that makes it particularly relevant. Before introducing our debates, what I'd like to do is to pay particular tribute to the Ukrainian people who, for almost 3 months, have been suffering from the assaults of the Russian army and are standing firm, which I think deserves our respect and our admiration. I also think that we can only pay tribute in this tragic context tribute to our ability as Europeans to marshal ourselves, to mobilize and take bold decisions together, decisions that are necessary to reinforce solidarity, unwavering solidarity to Ukraine, aid to Ukraine, particularly through the member states, in particular the states that border immediately the Ukraine, mentioned by the President of the Senate a moment ago, but also the others, the aid given to millions of Ukrainians that have fled the fighting with the support of the EU or across the board. I think also this needs to be unanimously paid tribute to as well. This desperate period, tragic period for our European continent, mustn't let us lose sight of the long-lasting challenges that the EU is grappling with. In other words, migratory challenges, features well among them. And I'm properly mindful of the fact that this is a sensitive matter, and there are divergences, quite deeply seated ones, within our governments, within our national assemblies, and within our public opinions, and that this can be the subject of instrumentalization by populist figures. I also think, however, that we can all see that our right and our European policies are not tailored to the current state of affairs, as borne out by the 2015 migratory crisis. Our coordination in managing our external borders was manifestly inadequate, just as our solidarity mechanisms in terms of asylum. Now, the pandemic, COVID, did bring down migratory pressure on the EU's borders, but it didn't dispel the long-standing problems for these member states to confront these matters on such a scale, on different modus operandi. Now, to meet this, the European Commission has put together a raft of proposals, and that in September 2020, taking the shape of a new migration and asylum compact. And I know some of these proposals have raised, quite legitimately, certain questions, and this is particularly the case for those bearing upon the filtering procedure on the borders of the Union. Now, these divergencies and these questions mustn't, however, stop us making progress in negotiating on this compact or this pact in terms of the because we cannot just have a loose consensus. I've also been able to see during a mission that I did for my committee on the migratory matter, and the report was handed out last week. The Dublin rule doesn't work anymore, let's face it, and these first-hit countries are overrun. People use every way to get round the system, and when transfer is done, you often see them back again only a few days later. So we need to really revise this rule, possibly abandoning the first entry country criteria, which is sometimes not effective nor fair. We need to see greater convergence of our national systems in asylum. Too many people offer consecutive requests in several member states. The new Asylum European Agency will help us. Ultimately, we'll have to envisage possibly mutual recognition of a rejection decision for asylum seeking. This is a question. It strikes me that the principle of a joint European asylum regimen means that we perhaps need to think about going down this road. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are the one or two avenues of thought that I lay before you before we launch into our debate. So it's by looking at this compass, if I can put it this way. Do forgive me. In the institutional framework of the EU, alongside the member states representing the Council and our colleagues in the European Parliament, we need to have our voices heard as parliamentarians as well as our points of view in order to feed in the future European legislation. But I would like to underscore the fact that in our dialogues and in our negotiations that will be taking place in conjunction with the European Commission about this pact, we always need to keep top of mind abiding by the values that bind us together. The return of war in Europe has shown us to what extent democracy and abiding by the rule of law are and remain fragile. On migratory matters, as on other matters that bring us together here, the matter of human rights shouldn't be negotiable. By respecting the human individual and protection offered to refugees is not incompatible with setting up a common management policy for migratory flows that is effective, fair, and operational. So by looking at this compass that I offer you to launch on your debates today, but we will start our first session devoted to managing the 2050 migratory crisis within the backdrop of the Ukrainian war. Let me hand over to Yael Brown-Pivet, President of the Law Committee of the National Assembly.
Thank you, Chairman Buffet. So we'd like to welcome Minister Marlene Schiappa, and I will hand her the floor. And then Madame Yael Brown-Pivet, President of the Law Committee for the National Assembly. So, Madam Chair, President, Minister, Chairman of the Law Committee, parliamentarians, allow me to thank you, first of all, Mr. President, for having organized this conference here in the framework of the French presidency of the European Union. I'm delighted to see us all gathered here at the initiative of the Senate for this interparliamentary conference on the challenges of migration. And I am also delighted to be speaking for the first time in the hemicycle. The migration issue is an important part of public debate, and we saw this in France during the presidential elections. I have already had the opportunity to say in this chamber, the National Assembly, that this is a subject which is extremely important because this is about the meeting between Europe and the rest of the world. By tackling this issue, we are speaking about ourselves, and we're also speaking about others. There are many people in France, as in many other countries of Europe, I imagine, who have been born out of the immigration process. Now, during these introductory words, I'd like to share three observations which can act as a guide throughout the discussions. My first observation is the following. Rejecting immigration by many European peoples, this should raise the alarm bells, and this is something that we should not ignore. In favor of certain political movements who like to up the ante on this theme, in France, just as in other European countries, it is absolutely vital to recall that immigration is also a source of wealth. It is an opportunity at the individual level because it raises us and brings us to meet and dialogue with others. But it's also an opportunity at a collective level for France and for Europe, which can grow by opening itself up to others. The migration policy requires us to find a balance, and this should be constantly questioned, a balance between responsibility, solidarity, and humanity. Since the 80s, immigration has always been considered, according to the political sensitivity, as an epiphenomenon which was not important and which didn't need to be tackled. It was seen as something evil and an existential threat for our countries. So I think that we need to introduce some rationality into the political and media debate. Migrations are an integral part of history and humanity, and this often generates fantasy and exaggeration. Of course, illegal crossings of the external borders need to be curbed with strength, and this concerns 150,000 people per year. That is 0.03% of the population of the European Union. We are far from being overwhelmed. Moreover, the confusion between immigration and insecurity has become part of the collective imagination and part of some populist discourses. This massive rejection of immigration requires more education, more rationality, and also more efficiency in terms of managing migration flows. We also owe this to the migrants themselves. They need to be better integrated, and we need to avoid placing in difficulties those who cannot be taken in. The second conviction, this is a balance between opening and managing the frontiers. The Union has made an important and efficient progress since the crisis of 2015. We know if the member states can provide responses to the migration challenges, these can only be valid if they are organized at the European level. Progress remains to be made, but we have already moved forward on this issue. In terms of protecting the external frontiers, Frontex has had its mandate extended and strengthened in order to become the agency of border and coast guards. It is now one of the cornerstones of the space of freedom, security and justice of the European Union. Our duty, human duty, is to save lives at sea and also to tackle the criminal networks. With the Frontex operations deployed by the European Union in the Mediterranean between 2015 and 2022, almost 600,000 lives have been saved. This figure is extremely high, and we can be delighted at this result. But we shouldn't forget the 20,500 human lives that have been lost over the same period. The Union must continue to fight against the people trafficking networks and work closely with the countries of origin, countries of transit of migrants in order to fight these networks. In order to achieve this, it needs sufficient resources. Efforts has been made in this respect. 22.7 billion euros will be devoted to this matter over the next 7 years to migration and management of borders. Also there will be 10,000 border guards which will be made available to the European Agency for Border Guards and Coast Guards. The external frontiers need to be better managed. This is a legitimate expectation, and it needs to be dealt with. My third conviction is that the future of the European Union will partially be played out by its ability to manage the migration issue. The actions taken within the framework of the French presidency contribute to this ambitious objective. The title of our conference says this: the migration issue is indeed a challenge. Free circulation within the European Union, control of the external borders are two parts of the same coin. The second makes the first possible. The recent events and the migration crisis of 2015 concerning the Syrian conflict and terrorist attacks have reminded of this. And it is also essential for the future of Europe to provide the necessary and dignified conditions for migrants. The migration issue is not just one other subject. It is about one of the most humane concerns. So let us rise to the challenge. We should avoid all forms of division. The situation and consequently the interests of the member states differ, but it's collectively that this can be overcome. Our capacity to reach agreement on this subject, and that will decide the future of the European Union. Each new president of the European Union should be the opportunity to take this issue a bit further. And this has been well understood by the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, who has made managing the frontiers and reform in the Schengen space one of the priorities of the French presidency. This requires a gradual approach, step by step. The creation of a Schengen Council is one step forward, an important step forward in order to strengthen the coherence of decisions taken at the national level. The new European Agency for Asylum started its work in January, and this is one other resource that the member states can use. Managing migration flows also requires determined effort on the part of Europe for prosperity and stability of its neighborhood, in particular Africa and the Balkans. I congratulate the major summit which was held under this presidency on 17th of February between the countries of the European Union and the African Union. They have reaffirmed their common desire to renew their partnership by which will be based on investments to the tune of 150 billion euros in order to strengthen stability, sovereignty, and the economies of the two continents. Of course, the question of taking in Ukrainian refugees is also very important. The European response to this tragedy has allowed us to measure how much has been done since 2015, but we will be coming back to this during the roundtable on this issue. Despite this progress, we must continue the work and come up with a European response to the challenges of asylum, strengthening external borders, and rebuilding a bilateral relationship with our British neighbours. I will be delighted to exchange with you on all these complex and important issues. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Je vais donner la parole.
I will now hand the floor to Madam Marlene Schepper, Delegate Minister of the Ministry of Interior in charge of citizenship.
Vous avez la parole, Madame la Ministre.
You have the floor.
de l'OCDE, Monsieur le
Secretary General of the OECD, citizens of the President, Minister, ladies and gentlemen, presidents, ladies and gentlemen of committees, ladies and gentlemen parliamentarians, directors. Please allow me, first of all, to apologize for the absence of Minister Darmanin, who has other engagements, and he has asked me to represent the government here today, and I'll do this with great pleasure. The dialogue between the parliaments of our different countries is part of European democracy, and I would like to greet and congratulate you for organizing this conference and the choice of placing the issue of migration on the agenda for your discussions. Now, before I briefly represent the priorities of the French presidency of the European Union, I'd like to talk about the war in Ukraine, which has been going on for 3 months. The war is waging on the doors of Europe and has thrown 6 million people onto the streets, especially women and children. This is a duty to take these people in the best possible conditions and to provide assistance to these families who have left behind them a father, a husband, a son, who are defending at the peril of their lives democracies, but also the ideals of Europe. We can say currently, and the French presidency has deployed much effort, we can say that the European Union has been up to the task for taking in these people. So we have immediately activated the European DCPR measures. As the Minister for Interior has called an extraordinary council with his counterparts to help displaced people who are arriving. Hundreds of thousands of these people are arriving in the European Union. From the 4th of March onwards, this allowed us to activate temporary protection for these people who were fleeing conflict. And this is a decision which is doubly historical. First of all, because it was taken very swiftly, and I'd like to congratulate the countries involved. Secondly, because it is the first time that this protection mechanism, which came from Directorate in 2001 following troubles in Kosovo, has actually been implemented. Since then, this mechanism has allowed thousands of people to benefit from residency permits and to find shelter, to be treated, educated, and to find work, and to be able to move around quite freely. Within the space of a few days, the European Union has provided an adequate response to this sudden influx of millions of people on its territory, and that is all in our honor. And I think that history will take account of that. Poland, whose mobilization I'd like to to mention, has made considerable efforts, as well as other neighbouring countries with Ukraine. France, which is further away geographically speaking, but also has a major Ukrainian diaspora already, and it has taken in already 80,000 people, and we will closely be reaching 100,000 people. France has seen an amazing wave of solidarity from the part of its citizens, and they have provided generous and efficient temporary protection. France is making every effort since the beginning of the war so that better coordination between the member states take place. Many questions had to be handled very swiftly and in a coordinated fashion, so the information of those people fleeing the conflict in terms of the entry in the European Union, regions where they can settle, and even though some of these mechanisms are already saturated and organising transport to those places. What is happening in Europe is something which is unprecedented since the Second World War. It's not a migration issue like any others. It's a movement of population within the confines of our continent. And we had to face the uniqueness, the newness of this situation. And in order to do this, we had to innovate and invent. And this is what we have been able to do together by creating this idea of displaced Europeans and also providing temporary protection. Each time we fail in the face of a crisis, it's because we applied answers, hard and fast answers. But due to our collective effort, we have been able, I believe, to avoid that failure. Collectively, we have decided to show solidarity and also to rise to the tasks. It would be remiss of me not to talk about the work of the European NGOs concerning sexual violence. This has been witnessed by Ukrainian women and children. Also, people trafficking, which is part of all people movements. In France, we have created an interministerial committee which is specifically tasked with fighting the trafficking of human beings. But this is also a European challenge. More generally, speaking about the migration issues and the priorities of the presidency. In terms of the French presidency, we will continue with the reforms of Schengen. This is a key issue. The failures of this space have not been sufficiently detective, haven't given rise to the sufficient political dialogue so that we can draw the lessons from this. In order to remedy this, we have set up in March the first Schengen Council. This is a new framework for discussion between ministers, which has made this a truly political issue, which will provide for more efficient management of the second Schengen area. The Schengen mechanism, the revision of the border codes is ongoing, and the text will allow us to have more efficient evaluation assessments in order to overcome the shortfalls of this system, and to have stronger controls at the border in order to fight against instrumentalization of migration. So the Migration and Asylum Pact, France wants to reform our migration policy and also draw lessons from the crisis of 2015-2016. So we welcome the proposal by the Commission in September 2020, prepared by the Office of Madame Paria, who is here today. We have always said that Europe cannot be satisfied with a situation where people enter or try to cross the border irregularly, where free circulation can be misused in order to abuse and misuse the asylum systems. But this burden is disproportionately shared between the countries of the European Union. So France has established robust procedures established at the border, and also relocalization to take place.
Also, for improving returns, the presidency should make every effort to try and renew all the aspects of this pact. And it's against this background that we proposed a new method, a gradual pact, so to take steps, advance this way, and This will touch on all aspects of the Pact: migration, asylum, and external borders. This was approved unanimously by the Interior Ministers and is also being negotiated. And this work will continue. At the moment, the technical councils within the Council, and we all hope that this will lead to political agreements by the end of June. Ladies and gentlemen, one thing is certain. On these questions of migration, solutions can only be at a European level. Only European is able to overcome this major challenge. The Ukrainian crisis and others, and this should inspire us for the future. This is not just about migrant flows or about figures. These are people. And I'd like to think of the young mother that I met while I was traveling with the President, who explained to us who she'd crossed the borders on foot with her daughter of 10 years old in her arms because she was exhausted and could no longer walk. I think we have to think of these people, and our actions should be guided by their needs. These should be discussed in detail over the course of the day, so I would wish you all fruitful discussions, and I thank you all for listening. Thank you. Thank you. I'd now give the floor to Mr. Matthias Cormann, who is the Secretary General of the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Thank you very much, President of the Senate, ministers, presidents of the law committees of the Senate and the National Assembly, parliamentarians, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak here today, and which allows me also to take part in an OECD meeting this evening at 6 o'clock. These have been difficult years marked by the pandemic, and we have all been shaken up by the terrible atrocities inflicted on the Ukrainian people following the war of aggression, an unjustified and illegal war conducted by Russia. This war has provoked an enormous humanitarian crisis, destroying lives, towns, infrastructure, with millions of people fleeing. Compassion, generosity, and the goodwill have been apparent across Europe, and welcoming Ukrainian refugees as well. Since the beginning of the Russian aggression on the 24th of February, 6 million Ukrainian refugees have fled their country. 5.2 million have entered the European Union. This is the biggest flow of migrants since the end of the Second World War. And more than 8 million people have been displaced internally in Ukraine. This requires great international solidarity to manage this crisis. Many countries are playing a role, but it's particularly the neighbouring countries of Ukraine who have deep roots with the Ukrainian people who are living up to this challenge. The OECD organized an exceptional working group at Warsaw to discuss the responses to the Ukrainian refugee crisis. This meeting highlighted the rapidity and the size of the aid required, not just in Ukraine, but all over Europe. This is an unprecedented level of support that is needed, and we need to be up to the task. There was incredible solidarity at Warsaw at the international high-level meeting organized by Sweden and Poland, which promised over 6 million euros of additional aid, humanitarian aid, to Ukraine. We congratulate the Council of the European Union for strengthening the support, for allowing different European Union members to spend 17 billion euros for refugees. We also welcome the activation of the European Directive on temporary protection as suggested by the French presidency of the European Union. This exceptional measure provides exceptional support for Ukrainian refugees who can stay for up to 3 years in any European Union countries and have full access to the labour market, healthcare, education and other essential services. We have learned a great deal from the Syrian refugee crisis, the importance of being prepared, rapid intervention, but also continuing to develop and use the competencies of the refugees themselves. On the other hand, the Ukrainian refugee crisis brings up new challenges. It's important to understand the differences in order to provide efficient responses. The first difference is the mobility of the Ukrainian population in the Schengen Agreement. This has to be managed with more coordination and more multilateral cooperation. We believe that over 2 million refugees from Ukraine have moved towards other countries outside the EU and the OECD. So 6 million in Germany, 630,000 in the Czech Republic, 70,000 have arrived here in France as well as in Italy and Spain. There are many displaced people. Most of them are women and children who have specific needs. And a third of the refugees are under 18 years old. We must make sure that all the children are safe at all times, especially unaccompanied minors. This is an enormous challenge for the education systems of the intake countries as well, who have to quickly adapt their systems to the needs of Ukrainian refugees. Psychological support, integration of local communities, support at school, which includes language skills of the languages of the intake countries. Integration for the children in the schools should take into account also the need to keep in contact with their Ukrainian teachers. Certain countries have accelerated distance learning concepts and other means. The other area is access for Ukrainian refugees to the labour market. This means recognizing their skills as well as providing support. And many OECD countries have suggested that refugees pursue further training. And we need to be very clear about the fact that this crisis is not a short-term crisis. There are many uncertainties. In actual fact, we don't know how long this war will last, and we don't know how it will develop. The Ukrainian refugees might have found refuge for the first instance in people's homes, but these are only temporary solutions. We need to be able to provide more humanitarian aid for a longer period. In this perspective, all support is essential, and people cannot be prevented from returning to Ukraine when the situation permits it. France is doing everything it can in terms of providing solidarity. It has a solid framework for taking in refugees, and Ukrainian refugees can and do rely on this. We need to strengthen integration measures and action on an interministerial level, as well as access to labour market allows us to also coordinate with the local labour authorities. Language learning in France, learning French is, of course, also important. And finally, we need to strengthen the local community's role, social partners and non-governmental organisations. All the measures undertaken by France are welcome. To underline the advantages of immigration, we need to have a policy that responds to the labour market needs as well, which also offers training to allow refugees to integrate into the labour market, promoting the adoption of language norms of the receiving countries as well. The war in Ukraine affects our values, rule of law, democracy, human rights, and a labour market based on international order, based on an agreed system of rules. Our responsibility is to integrate Ukrainian refugees with dignity. This is essential. It underlines our values. It is the base of our actions for conducting better policies to ensure that the refugees can have a better life. Our service is willing to take all your questions, and I would like to wish you fruitful discussions today. Thank you very much, Mr. Corman, for these remarks from the OECD. We're now going to start the first session about learning the lessons from the 2015 crisis in the light of the Ukraine war. And I'd like to give the floor to Mr. François-Noël Bouvet, Chair of the Senate Law Committee.
Bien, mesdames, messieurs, chers collègues.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Nous avons permis à monsieur Corman de pouvoir s'exprimer.
Thank you to Mr. Corman for his
Il
remarks.
devait effectivement intervenir à l'occasion de notre
He was supposed to speak at our first session, the subject of which is what lessons can be learned in the light of the Ukraine war.
depuis 2015, depuis la crise de 2015.
Since the crisis of 2015, how has Europe responded? So I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Yael Brown-Pivet, Chair of the National Assembly Law Committee. She will have the floor for 10 minutes. President Buffet, Minister Miniti, Director General, Secretary General, parliamentarians. So dedicating the first round table to the consequences of the Ukraine war is obvious today. This will provide important lessons and things that we can learn regarding the Ukrainian refugees. To me, it seems essential, to begin with, to highlight the current situation against the background of the crisis from 2012. Let's remember that when the conflict in Syria intensified, many refugees came to Europe. There were many ships that sank, and we cannot forget the 1,200 people drowned in April 2015 alone off the coast of Greece. A migrant crisis, what is that? Well, it has become something that appears in the headlines all the time to describe the flows of refugees who are trying to reach our shores. There were 1 million people that arrived in 2015 in Greece, Italy and Spain. In 2016, the member states of the European Union recorded 1.2 applications for asylum. Between 2017 and 2019, this was between 470,000 and 740,000, and in 2020 it was about 100,000. This shows the dimensions of the asylum applications. And this caused a number of different reactions. There was much solidarity for some people, hostility and rejection by others. And it showed certain aspects of the European Union, certain shortcomings. The Union was not able to respond in an efficient manner to this situation. The Dublin III Regulation showed also its shortcomings. This regulation means that only one member state is responsible for processing an asylum application. But the country concerned is often the first host country, Spain, Italy, Greece, Bulgaria as well. And the system has been criticized by everyone. It places too great a burden on the first host countries and doesn't take into account the lives or the intentions of the asylum seekers. In September 2015, the European Commission decided to have a vote on the transfer system according to a distribution key, taking into account the economic situation and the demographic situation of the countries. This was abandoned 1 year later because certain countries refused to apply it. In March 2016, an agreement was found with Turkey, which for €6 billion was charged with increasing the surveillance on its coasts to try and dissuade migrants from coming. And since then, the European Union has been striving to come up with a new system. Negotiations have quickly become bogged down in the details. And in this context, the European Commission presented a new Pact for Asylum and Migration with 5 legislative texts and a rule which will respond to 3 main objectives. Ensure the sharing of responsibilities based on a solidarity mechanism. Determine in an effective manner one member state responsible for processing requests for international protection and discouraging misuse and secondary movements within the European Union. And of course, this text has been met with some doubts by the first host countries. We have to take note of this, but we have to continue with the reform of the Schengen Agreement. On the 9th of December 2021, while presenting the programme of the French presidency of the EU, the President, Mr. Macron, said that he would like to see this pact advance. A sovereign Europe is a Europe that is able to manage its external borders. Under the French presidency, the European Union was confronted with a conflict. War is back on our soil. On the 24th of February, the war unleashed by Russia is an illegal violation of international law and our basic principles of the United Nations. It is a major threat for Europeans and for our security. And this means that we are trying to respond with firmness to the Russian aggression. The European Commission and the European Parliament, together with France, has made every effort to come up with a response that is strong. Sanctions against Russia, but also supporting Ukraine, unparalleled military support and financial assistance. 7 years after the migration crisis of 2015, this invasion had the consequence of displacing millions of people. Internal displacements, 7 million people displaced within the European Union, and external as well. 5.5 million Ukrainians had to flee their country, according to UNHCR. 90% are women and children. From the 1st of April, a quarter of the Ukrainian population will have been displaced or exiled. It's the largest refugee crisis that the world has known since the Second World War. At the external borders of the European Union, many people try to seek protection in the member states. These are Ukrainians, but also those who live in Ukraine and are threatened by Russian troops. The Council of the European activated the temporary protection mechanism from July 2001 to benefit Ukrainian refugees. This is the first time this text has been activated, and the rapidity with which this is done should be welcomed. This protection provides a stay of 6 months can be extended up to 3 years for 3 categories of people: Ukrainians who live in Ukraine, third country nationals, or stateless people who are residing in Ukraine and their families. This has 2 advantages, the system. First of all, it allows displaced persons to have the same rights all over the EU and to have a sufficient level of protection. Right to stay, access to the labour market, to housing, schooling, healthcare, and other means to survive. Secondly, it allows the capacities of the member states concerned to cope, because the refugees don't have to ask for international protection. I'd like to congratulate the member states who have welcomed this immense flow of refugees, particularly the Polish, who have welcomed more than half of the refugees from Ukraine, but also Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary. I'd also like to underline the activities of France, which has been to provide important financial assistance to Ukraine, and many local communities and associations, as well as individuals, have made a great effort to welcome Ukrainians. More than 70,000 have joined us. The European Union has been able to come up with efficient short-term answers, but the long-term structural model still has to be developed. So Europe has to live up to this challenge. And I'd like to congratulate this roundtable and encourage it in its work on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We turn now to Monique Paria, Director General of the Directorate General Migration and Home Affairs of the European Commission. Welcome.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President of the Senate Law Committee and the National Assembly Law Committee, MPs, senators, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be among you this morning and to offer a contribution to this work. The migratory crisis of 2015, as well as the migratory pressure that has occurred since, be it in the Balkans, the Mediterranean, the English Channel, or more recently in the Belarusian border, and how things have developed since the Ukrainian conflict. This shows very clearly that migratory challenges and migratory policies are a red thread to grapple with within the EU. Now, to understand how far we've come since 2015, and think about the problems that need to be ironed out, I think it's important that we agree on what we mean by a migratory policy. Perhaps I can start with an observation. It's a complex arena involving a number of facets to migration. We don't talk much of this, but of course there's lawful migration. Every year, we have between 2 and 3 million people who enter the EU lawfully from third-party countries to work or join family members, and they cross the border lawfully. A number of figures have been mentioned, but over the last few years, unlawful entry into the EU has got, it's between 140,000 and 200,000 individuals. There's also a distinction to be made between economic migrant and refugee. Lots of solidarity was expressed to the Ukrainian people, muddling up these two notions of migrant and refugee. And then the third point I'd like to lay before you, the increasing number of crises that have arisen since 2015, differing in nature sometimes, differing in scale, but they come and go more and more quickly. And I think this shows how that it is even more important to establish a genuine European policy in respect of migration. Now, the migratory policy within Europe is designed essentially to manage in a structured and sustainable fashion the migratory flows coming into the EU, to manage them among EU members and in conjunction with our third-party country partners. Now, where do things stand, very quickly, about how things have been achieved since 2015? On an upbeat note, we can say that there's significant progress that's been made to improve our understanding of the real-time grassroots situation and to pick up on those with foresight, managing crises across the EU with the Blueprint Network. This was established in 2020, and this Blueprint Network offers a swift analysis of migratory flows. Information is circulated effectively, and we can appraise needs accurately. And in terms of Ukraine, we have daily reports on the changing face of the situation on the ground. And this is the finest tuned understanding we have to date of what's going on the ground. There's also another report on the changing circumstances in respect of Afghanistan and Belarus. And this mechanism has proved to be very useful in managing the various crises I've enumerated. This better understanding has also enabled us to activate as early as possible and more effectively this European civil protection mechanism after the Ukraine crisis, as early as February, in fact. Slovakia, Poland, and the Czech Republic triggered that mechanism, and 11 member states offered temporary accommodation, medical apparatus, medication. Since 2015, additional financial resources have been made available for managing migratory flows, whereas over 2014-2020, 10 billion euros were devoted to migratory matters and managing borders. And for 2021-2027, the budget has increased to 16.2 billion, with an additional 2 billion if you add the Fund for European Safety and Security. The third point, an increasing of European agencies' abilities to respond. We've talked about Frontex. This was the first agency to be considerably stepped up with the incremental setting up or introduction of 10,000 extra border officials, with a budget around 1 billion a year now, just shy of that number. Same thing for the European Asylum Agency. Its resources were increased, and very soon 500 experts will be allocated to it, so it can pick up on increased needs and responding to asylum matters. The last point, we've also understood and improved our engagement with transit countries and origin countries. The EU is speaking with one voice on the international stage to this very matter. We now have more significant levers to pull, more effective levers to pull, which is borne out in managing the Belarus crisis, or the Iraq-Minsk flights. Those were managed, which bears out the value added of providing a common front among EU member states under the banner of the Commission to stem migratory flows, particularly when migration is instrumentalized. Now, all these areas of progress, very tangible, thinking about a solidarity-based European front, it's crucial to pick up on this sensitive matter of sharing out migrants among EU members. As you will appreciate, the previous committee was unable to have its proposals approved. And this is why the current committee, since it was mentioned that the European Migration Pact, which was submitted in 2020, was talked about, this offers an equilibrium between responsibility and solidarity. It was also reminded us a moment ago that the Dublin Regulation provides for responsibility of first receipt countries, with some exceptions. If there are family links, for example, family ties or professional ties in other countries. But it's quite obvious that in order to subscribe to responsibility obligations in terms of managing borders, and we'll return to this matter later on this afternoon, but it's very important that there is genuine solidarity among EU members, particularly with receiving individuals coming into the EU. Ukraine's example shows that that is very possible. And it was reiterated by all the previous speakers. We've welcomed more than 5 million refugees, Ukrainian refugees, into the EU without any solidarity or mandatory solidarity mechanism. So it's therefore possible to do, but I think we also need to recognize that that solidarity is less spontaneous when addressing people who come into the EU but don't require international protection. Now, there's a tricky situation with migrants saved on the high seas. Quite clearly, managing them can not only fall upon the EU members where these migrants arrive, and the EU Migration Pact, the proposal going to managing migration and asylum that should substitute the Dublin III Regulation, offers an answer which isn't confined to tricky matters of which member state is responsible for appraising an international protection request, but also offers a solidarity-based system, one which is supple, flexible, where contributions can be made either to relocation efforts or other forms of contribution that are more innovative. For example, taking responsibility for some relocations or again, financial mechanisms. Now, solidarity mechanism, this encompasses the arrival of an individual from being saved on the seas, as well as migratory pressure circumstances. And we've also offered an additional regulation to take into consideration crisis circumstances or force majeure that ultimately should replace temporary protection regulation, which for the very first time was implemented in the Ukraine situation. So for this type of European solidarity to materialize, all member states should be equipped with the ability to implement it and make sure that it has the wherewithal to receive these asylum requests and also relocation procedures. Now, with regard to Ukraine, we've set up a solidarity platform, an immediate response platform. It's a good example of coordination of EU resources during a crisis. In the long term, the proposal for a regulation going to managing migration and asylum offers the Commission to adopt a European strategy. This would involve understanding the situation as it stands and as is expected to evolve on the migratory plan, and implement national strategies to make sure that capacities and resources are man enough for the job, available and man enough for the job. Now, as you'll know, and this was reiterated, this pact emerges from complex and difficult negotiation. We can see that to bring out a compromise on a solidarity-based mechanism this involves making efforts in other fields to avoid triggering this mechanism where it's unnecessary. We want to make sure that we can deal with unlawful entry into the EU. We also want to avoid any abuse of asylum status. And in 2016, as early as 2016, we offered recommendations to accelerate, to fast-track requests and look at addressing ill-founded asylum requests on the borders. And within this pact, we've made a more ambitious proposal, namely managing asylum on the borders in respect of all individuals for whom asylum conditions are unlikely to be green-lighted and approved by the respective authorities. Quite clearly, this stepped-up solidarity needs to go hand-in-hand with stepping up protection on the border. We'll talk about this afternoon, so I'm not going to dwell on that at this juncture. And a third point, managing migratory flows. This policy can only be done in conjunction with source and transit countries. And this is why the EU Migration Pact, among its three priorities, provides for reinforcing cooperation among origin countries. Strategic partnerships need to be struck up with these countries. As you know, the political underlying is crucial to avoid divergences in respect of this pact. The French presidency, the president of the Law Committee reminded us of this, offered an incremental approach with respect to this pact, the idea being that each state needs to make significant progress simultaneously on the solidarity, external dimensions, and also responsibility. We support this approach, and it's our hope that in the next Council of beginning of June, we'll be able to make material progress in respect of that. Having said that, this pact is negotiated in conjunction with the European Parliament, and so it's very important that member states also work in conjunction with said Parliament to find an umbrella agreement. Only two components have been adopted currently: the directive on payment cards, credit cards, and the Agency for Asylum. So it's half-time now in the Commission's mandate and the European Parliament. So it's very important that we can make material progress on this pact to avoid that we all grind to a halt with the establishment of a European policy going to asylum and migration. And I'm banking on you to encourage your colleagues in your respective national parliaments and the ministers of the member states to find an agreement on this European Pact for Migration and Asylum. Thanks very much.
Merci.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Directrice Générale.
Thank you, Madam Director General, for your statement and also these very concise statements. I'd like to welcome Mr. Malcolm Minetti, former Minister of Interior for the Republic of Italy and President of the Meadow Foundation de Leonardo. You have the floor. You have the floor. Thank you, President. Thank you for the invitation that you have extended to me. I'm extremely grateful for this. But above all, thank you for this extraordinary initiative that you've taken. It's a very important message for all European countries. So I'd like to express a hope. I hope that this wave that is starting from the French Senate can also reach other European parliamentarians. It would be very nice if we had a very intense session of sessions so that we can come here to take stock of the situation. And it would be a way of responding as Europeans to an unprecedented challenge because the numbers crisis are as announced by previous speakers, and it's quite extraordinary that Europe has responded in and shown such solidarity and such a unique response. In fact, the aggressors probably didn't expect Europe to show such solidarity. So I'd like to point out the situation concerning another crisis. We've seen that the war in Ukraine has produced is also causing a food crisis throughout the world, and especially on the other side of the Mediterranean, on the African shores. And most of these African countries depend for their grain on Russian or Ukrainian grain, and in some countries this is to the extent of more than 90%. Now, if we don't manage to create corridors for grain from Ukraine, there is a serious risk that we will have serious lacks of food in northern African countries. And so if there's a lack of food, if there's a lack of bread, of course, this means that there will be extreme social tensions. Now, if anybody had any doubts about this, you just need to think about what happened in 2011, not in 2015, but just in 2011. Let's go back in time somewhat. So these were social tensions, and this can lead to an explosion of a humanitarian crisis, not just in Ukraine, but also in Africa. You understand that Europe could be at the very center of a dramatic crisis. So we've got the crisis in Ukraine, but then we also have a crisis on the southern shores in Africa. So you understand the importance of this challenge. If anybody had any doubts on this, you just need to think about the fact that immigration has been used as a geopolitical weapon in the past. Let's not forget what happened in November 2021. So this is a word which should never be cancelled from memory, because first of all there was Bilowiec, and then there was the invasion. First pressure was used on concerning migrants, and then there was an invasion, a military invasion. Now, you understand that a situation of this nature needs to be tackled over time. It's not just we're not talking about years, but perhaps months or weeks. And so this is why we need. And I'm sorry if I'm getting right to the nitty-gritty of the discussions, but in 2015, 2016, 2017, I was in Italy, and I was in the government, and I had to deal with this migration crisis. So I know what this means. So there's an issue of time. We need to move extremely swiftly. We need to move duly on this. So the first is to have a clear idea, a clear concept of this paradigm. Migration not necessarily about emergencies. This is the structural fact of populations. Nobody can cancel these out. Immigrations cannot be cancelled. So the major democracies have to manage these migration flows, govern them, and but also by overcoming the illegal migration. So this is also the meaning of the previous, behind the speech of the previous speaker. Now, given the situation, we must understand so this is a race against time. In February of this year, in Paris, there was an important meeting on Africa, and I believe that the crisis is not just in Ukraine but also in Africa. So we need to have a European policy for Africa, because many major countries in the world, China and Russia, also have a policy on Africa. And Europe needs to catch up to design and elaborate a policy for Africa. We can't leave this part of the world in the hands of these major countries. Europe needs to be in Africa. We need a project, a program. We have to think about this idea of perhaps sending 100 billion euros to Africa, but we need to do this immediately. We can't wait another 2 or 3 years to come up with these major projects. We have to do it now. A migration compact for Africa, for Northern Africa, not in a couple of months' time, but in a couple of weeks' time. And also an economic plan for Northern African countries, which allow them to face the food crisis, which allow them to deal with issues that would avoid social tensions. So a pact which is very easy with Northern African countries, and we will help you in this. So we'll help you with economic growth, we'll help you with stability and prosperity. And also fight against the traffic of human people. And let's build legal pathways for migration. Big human corridors for people. So these. For refugees. See, however, if we leave these African countries in the hands of these people traffickers, then we are violating many principles of our world and Europe. So the idea is a very simple one. We should change, as has already been said. We need to change the internal dimension of Europe. I'm an Italian, and for me it's quite clear that we need to change the Dublin Agreement. It doesn't achieve its means. Do away with this idea of the country of first entry. If we want to change the internal dimension of Europe, we have to start with the external dimension of Europe. So is it clear what I'm saying? Because if we deal with the problems in Africa, and I'm saying this as a European, I'm saying this as a person who has also occupied political points, it's easier to deal with the internal dimension because we have been able to manage flows from Africa. But if these flows arrive without any control in Europe, it's very difficult to face this. And also there will be internal divisions. Now, let me be clear. We need redistribution. But we need to manage these migration flows. If there's no control of these flows of migration, then there's no internal control. As things are decided unanimously, we need to listen to the reasons of everybody. So I say this as an Italian and being from one of the countries on the front line. So we know what the challenge is that's facing us. We know what we have to do. So in this way, we can build the conditions for a stable mechanism. So I'm sorry that I've run out of time. In terms of European populations, there are two major sentiments. I call them sentiments, and this is something which is very important. The first, and what we talked about today, the first is solidarity. There's no doubt here. There's a part of ourselves which wants to show solidarity, and this is extremely important to give a response, to show solidarity. But then there's another part, another feeling, which is about our own security, our own safety, collective and individual safety. So a huge continent like Europe that has made freedom one of its founding principles, that we cannot undermine, and safety and freedom. We need to have both things. You can't have one without the other. So we can't reason like that because we are part of a democracy. So we need. So we can't oppose safety and freedom. That would be the death of our democracies. So we need to reconcile these two principles. And I know that this is extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. But this is why Europe was created. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you. Now we're going to give the floor to those people who've requested to speak. Thank you to the previous speakers for opening this first session. Now, there are many people on the list who would like to take the floor. And to be quite honest with you, there are more than about 30 people on the list. Now, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes per person. So I'm going to have to be the gendarme here, so I apologize for that. And I will hand the floor immediately to Mr. André Benezik from the Czech Republic. So you can speak from your seat. Thank you.
Vous avez la parole.
You have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, since the start of the war, over 335,000 persons have obtained the temporary protection that is equivalent to little over 3% of our population. Overall, the Czech Republic has the highest per capita number of temporary protection cases in the EU. All persons have access to their basic needs in accordance with EU rules on temporary protection, accommodation for the needy, financial humanitarian aid, full access to health insurance and the labor market, as well as other services such as education. We expect that most refugees will remain in the country until the end of the war. The registration and assistance system works very well, also thanks to the involvement of civil society. Overall, the Czech Republic has the highest per capita number of temporary protection cases in the EU. Thus, the state reception capacities and capacities provided at regional level are almost exhausted at the moment, which is why the Czech Republic has requested European and international assistance, in particular support to create additional accommodation capacities for 50,000 people. Based on the government's decision, we are developing strategic priorities for coping with the refugee wave into concrete measures in 13 areas: accommodation, education, medical care, social services, and so on. Within the EU, the debate on financial support and preparation for the possible arrival of additional refugees and the rapid transport to EU countries with available reception capacity is crucial. We also see the EU registration platform for temporary protection as a key element. Despite the enormous pressure on our system, the Czech Republic is trying to provide assistance abroad within its own means. The Czech government has allocated humanitarian aid of 12 million euro. Concrete projects are already being implemented in Ukraine, assisting internal refugees, or in Moldova. Let me sum up. The Czech Republic has no border with Ukraine. Most of the refugees get to the Czech Republic through Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary. We are a country of 10 million people, currently hosting over 300,000 refugees, which is the highest number per capita in the European Union. And one important thing to mention, we also have Ukrainian refugees with Hungarian citizenship, but they do not seek refuge in Hungary, but in the Czech Republic. Thank you.
Merci, chers collègues. Monsieur Jean-Yves Lecomte, sénateur français. Se prépare Madame Danuta Jalowiecka. Je crois que sur les écrans, vous devez voir les intervenants. C'est ce qu'on me dit en tous les cas. Voilà, Monsieur Lecomte.
Mr. Lecomte, thank you. Thank you, President. So I don't like to talk about the migratory crisis of 2015. So Afghans and other nationals shouldn't they see that our obligations under the Geneva Convention are honoured? So they should be able to take these people in. But there was a lack of solidarity, a lack of coordination between the several countries of the European Union, which meant a lack of coordination. But today things have changed. We are all completely overwhelmed and dazzled by the tragedy, the violence that has befallen the Ukrainian people, and our reaction is better than what we were able to do in 2015. First of all, it should be said that the response, or the strongest response, should be a response from citizens. I'm referring in particular to the countries of Central Europe, and particularly Poland. So these are European citizens who perhaps who are trying to respond as best they can to the needs of those people arriving on their territory. And then civil society as more than the state. For integration to be successful, it shouldn't just be the policy of Europe or one particular state. It needs to be a policy which is pursued and which is implemented by all citizens, accompanied by civil society. And what is happening in Poland is quite remarkable in this respect. Temporary protection, which has been activated for the first time, allows also freedom of circulation within the European Union, allows people to have access to language learning, training, and so these are new rights for those people who have come for protection. And things are going well. This is an unprecedented challenge, but things seem to be working well. So what are the consequences that we can learn from this? Perhaps for better integration, we should improve the freedom of movement of those people who are protected within the European Union. I think that France, which hasn't provided this freedom of circulation, that is not normal. Also provide quicker access to language learning and also to the labour markets in European countries, because immigration which succeeds has to be organised. So we need to also have better identification and safer. And Eurodac Plus, for example, with more terminals, more registrations and more photos. This would allow better understanding and better knowledge of those people who are entering our territory. So this means also changing the Dublin regulations. It is not normal for people to be in one place and have to wait for months for their asylum to come up. Yes, we have to fight secondary movements if those are illegal. So that means that the person has already asked for asylum in another country. In that particular case, we need to work on mutual recognition of asylum demands. So if we can't all agree on this, let's at least do it amongst some of us. So please, can you conclude? I think it's important to reform with a sense of dignity and take into account the experiences that we're currently witnessing with the Ukrainian tragedy. Thank you, Mr. Lecomte. Madam Danuta Żelewieska, and then Mr. Popescu. You have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. President, dear colleagues, as a result of Russian invasion of Ukraine from February 24 to May 9, the number of people leaving Ukraine and coming to Poland exceed 3 million. More than 2 million stayed in Poland. Most of refugees benefit from the regular people, local non-profit organizations and local governments. But this compassion comes with the price and the cost. In some eastern Polish towns, every second person, or in some two-thirds of inhabitants, are Ukrainians. With rapidly growing inflation and unstable situation, it is becoming the great challenge of both authorities, especially local, and society. There is a growing need for additional funds that can help especially local government, NGOs and regular people to bear additional cost of their help. Mr. Matthias Cormann, Secretary General of OECD, expressed who the refugees are and what kind of support they need. So please let me just add. Among refugees, there are also unaccompanied children. In Poland, we introduced special solution created to the need for special protection of unaccompanied children and institution of temporary guardian. It is a legal solution dedicated to the current extraordinary situation. A temporary guardian is appointed by the guardianship court. His tasks include representation and taking care of the child and his/her property. One of the main tasks of Poland is to ensure the possibility of continuing education for all Ukrainians coming to Poland. Almost of 200,000 children and young people joined the Polish education system. This is a large and unforeseen burden for the budgets of local governments, but also a logistical burden requiring the reorganization and functioning of schools. The current situation related to the mass influx of refugees from Ukraine creates additional challenges, including for labor markets and social protection system. At the moment, there are no systematic solutions to integrate Ukrainian citizens into the labor market, such as vocational training or language courses, and to ensure protection against social exclusion. Any activity in this field is carried out by non-profit organizations or local governments. There is also a great challenge related to social security for Ukrainians. Some of them will probably come back to rebuild Ukraine after the Russian invasion, but some of them will be too elderly and vulnerable, thank you, to come back. Polish system of social security is not prepared to accommodate thousands of additional retired people. We need to be prepared and create mechanisms that will help to provide them with their well-deserved pension. In cooperation with Ukraine, maybe we need to make more usage of the current legal framework, make association agreement more lively instrument, better adjust and current challenges by using association council, which has instrument for amending association agreement to some extent. At the end, I would like also to express my support for the Czech colleagues, his calls for the EU institutional support. Thank you.
Merci, Madame. Monsieur Pavel Popieșcu.
Mr. Pavel Popieșcu, and then Mr. Ludovic Goga. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Dear friends, first of all, I would like to thank you, dear French friends, for bringing your troops in our land in Romania on the eastern flank. We thank you very much for that. Dear friends, Count Alexander de Marrakesh said once, "The betrayal starts when you do not tell your friend the truth, even with the purpose to protect his sensitivity. I prefer to be now uncomfortable, but to live with my heart at peace. For years from now, inside our European family, when it was the time to speak about different elephants in the room, we were not fair enough. For us, the Romanians, one elephant is representing the border control and the freedom of moving in Schengen. Protecting the largest European and NATO border with Ukraine, 650 kilometers, from this cruel war, with warm hearts, we opened our country for our future European brothers, the Ukrainian people. The current situation is hardly comparable with the migration crisis in 2015. We are facing an unprecedented situation in which we have to provide humanitarian assistance to a large number of refugees, mostly women and children. It is not easy to do it. I tell you this with full honesty. But we proved we can do it. We did it for almost 1 million people. 1 million people crossing our borders. Because we proved that we can be part of this select club, we expect this time our European family will not hide anymore, as in the past did, under classical technical arguments. Dear friends, Napoleon said, there are only two powers in the world, the power of the sword and the power of the spirit. In the long run, the sword is always defeated by the spirit. I truly believe that our European spirit will defeat the cruel Russian sword. Let's stay united for Ukraine. God bless you all.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Mr. Ludovic Goga, and after that, Madam Laura Miela Fulganu-Moaguer. I hope I've pronounced those names correctly. Thank you.
I want, first of all, thank you, your French colleagues, to organize this interparliamentary conference. And let's start. Dear colleagues, I would ask this question the other way around, meaning, what did we not learn from the migration crisis of 2015? Today, we already know that the humanitarian crisis can unfortunately happen anytime and anywhere, whether it is in the Balkans, North Africa, the Middle East, or our Eastern European neighbor, Ukraine. When I heard that the crisis in Ukraine has shown the eastern states, which in 2015 strongly rejected the uncontrolled influx of migrants and migration quotas, that they were wrong, I must disagree. On the contrary, this crisis has shown us that we were right all along. Ukraine is an immediate neighbor of the EU. It shares our values and cultural settings, and therefore it is our duty to help them. However, the EU does not have the capacities to be at the forefront and absorb millions of migrants from all over the world who, moreover, in majority cases, do not add value and are not interested in embracing our values and respecting our rules. We have also not learned that it is futile to try to cover up the inability to deal with illegal migration by promoting it as a solution to all the EU economic problems, as the European Commission seeks to do in the new proposals on single permits and long-term residence directives. Migration is not answer to our problems. Thank you for the floor.
Merci, chers collègues.
Thank you. And now, Madam Laura Mela Fulganu Muagur. And after that, it will be Mr. Daniel Milewski.
Domnule președinte, în primul rând țin să felicit comisiile din Parlamentul Franței care au avut inițiativa organizării acestei conferințe interparlamentare în domeniul migrației. Un subiect care, de 7 ani, a devenit pentru lagărul civilizației, leagănul Europei, o provocare, dar și un bun prilej în a demonstra încă o dată perenitatea unora dintre valorile de preț care a fost clădită societatea europeană, așa cum o trăim astăzi, solidaritate și umanitate. Acest început de mileniu a adus crize umanitare în Europa, tărâm care a fost soluția pentru cei care au fost forțați să-și părăsească țările natale.
There are many people who are responding to the humanitarian crisis. It's a solution for many people who are forced to leave their country. We're talking also about those who left North Africa, Syria, Jordan, and recently Ukraine. The crisis in 2015 put the spotlight on this question at the European Union level and for the member states. Certain measures were taken, certain immediate measures and certain long-term measures with the aim of stabilizing the situation. These measures were defined in the European agenda for migration, a paper adopted by the European Commission on the 13th of May 2015, with the aim of better managing migration on all these aspects. It's the decision for transfers as well. And many people need international protection. And we are confronted with, we have been confronted for the last 2 months with an unparalleled situation which has tested our administrative capacities, our human and financial aid capacities as well. And we see what is happening in this conflict zone, which borders Romania. Romania's efforts have been enormous, and the first thing is that Romania has become a logistics base for much of the humanitarian aid and military aid for Ukraine, and the massive flow of refugees that have been welcomed in Romania as well. The war that was unleashed on the 24th of February has led to more than 7 or millions of Ukrainian refugees leaving their country, and Romania has 600 miles of border with Ukraine and 680 kilometers with Moldova. And systematic controls have been carried out for everybody. I personally went to these borders, and I can assure you that since the very first day, that the main spirit of these activities is solidarity and solidarity for these citizens. Thank you. Now we welcome Mr. Daniel Milewski and then Carmen Iliana Mihăilescu from Romania.
Yes, in 2015, Poland made vocal its opposition to the EU's approach to migration crisis. We took a different view. We advocated reinforcement of the EU external borders, and we warned against the consequences of uncontrolled and unlimited influx of immigrants. But at the same time, then, we had also accepted more than 1 million Ukrainians whose country was already being badly affected by war, which started in 2014. Last year, in Polish circumstances, the European immigrant crisis took a more dangerous turn when economic migrants were cynically used by Alexander Lukashenko and his regime in what proved to be an orchestrated and organized crisis at the Polish border. Their goal was crystal clear, and it was to undermine European unity, to provoke inner political turbulence. It was Putin's first act in current war, to make sure that Poland and EU would fail to help Ukrainians in the event of full-scale aggression on their country. Now we have accepted over 3 million refugees from Ukraine in solidarity with our neighboring country, admiring, as we do, how the Ukrainians have continued to bravely fight for their liberty, for their independence, for the very survival of their nation. Dear colleagues, I requested the office of the conference to send you the presentation, The Refugee Crisis in Europe and Poland, which shows the magnitude of Poland's engagement in handling these extraordinary consequences of Putin's genocidal war. If it's possible, if you can, please open it. These numbers: 3.4 million women, children, the elderly, disabled, mainly at our homes, not in refugee camps, with full integration. We issued more than 1 million social security numbers. All refugees are eligible for free healthcare and social security support, similarly to Polish citizens. We have incorporated 120,000 of them into our labor market. Kids are in our schools since first days of the war. Their sense of dignity is our priority. From this perspective, the following lesson can be learned from the war in Ukraine and full 7 years after 2015 migration crisis. The very best way to solve a refugee crisis is to offer as much help as possible in neighboring countries. In all circumstances, the EU borders must be protected. We must remember our recent history. We must do better in future, which starts today. Thank you all.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Mihăilescu, and then Mr. Garuti from the Italian Senate.
Dear colleagues, without any other introduction, I'd like to tell you the fact that Romania has committed to host all the refugees coming from Ukraine, providing all the needed support. We consider that the EU and the member states should prove their solidarity with the refugees in these difficult times by welcoming them and supporting their needs. It is a real challenge and we need to adapt our common response. Romania appreciates the initiatives of Poland and Sweden to organize the Donors Conference on 5th of May and its results. We participated at Prime Minister level and has announced an additional contribution of 3.2 million euro in kind combustible. At the same time, Romania appreciates COM's initiatives to create a fiduciary fund for Ukraine. The Romanian government actually adopted 2 consistent packages of humanitarian assistance for Ukraine and set up an online platform to coordinate and channel the assistance provided by Romanian private entities and NGOs. The logistics center for storage and distribution of humanitarian assistance in Suceava is functioning well. Do not forget the Republic of Moldova they also need our support in order to help them face multiple challenges: refugees, energy cost, resilience, and security. Romania is making a consistent financial effort to ensure a proper response to the current crisis and to show its solidarity. This is not an easy task for us, especially since we need to stick to our fiscal commitments at EU level. So, dear colleagues, let's stay all together and do our best. Thank you very much.
Merci, Madame. Monsieur Garouti, ensuite ce sera Monsieur Kaminis du Parlement grec.
Mr. Garouti. Thank you, President, and thank you for this invitation and for the previous speakers and all the concerns they've raised. So I have a couple of observations that I can contribute to this debate. The pandemic and the war in Ukraine has made the situation in Europe very fragile. I think that this, the idea is not just to consider the legal and illegal situation. It's not just distinguishing refugees from migrants. The theme, I think, is more about understanding what migration is and truly is in this century. Our European Union has not been able to give a coherent response to this crisis. Is it just about people escaping poverty or war? There are young people and adults that are also moving between European states because they don't find work or they refuse consumer way of life. They decide to move elsewhere to seek jobs. Now, today, the question is more serious. Who are these new migrants? The migration crisis has highlighted the necessity to change the migration laws. Asylum seekers are not currently managed in a uniform way across Europe. Also, the percentage of positive or favorable decisions varies between the different European countries, and the European seekers travel through Europe and ask for asylum in those countries where they deem that there is more protection or more chance of protection. So we need to substitute the Dublin system with a new system of migration and asylum, which better distributes the burden amongst the European states. Also strengthen up security through strengthening Eurodac. So we need to share resources, better defend the borders, and also have clear administrative procedures whereby countries like France and Italy don't take a step backwards in terms of the fight against human rights, fight against the protection of human rights. So the international communities must all act together and push in the same direction. What does it mean then? It means that the mechanism for taking in these refugees needs to be much more efficient, and also has to be an equal sharing of the burden. And in order to overcome the political distance in terms of the mechanism of reallocating or relocating the refugees, from this point of view, the proposal of the European Union to the crisis in Ukraine has been absolutely wonderful. So it has managed to act in a very short period of time. They have instituted the temporary protection mechanism and have been able to take in the displaced people and award them and allow them to benefit from social rights. So those people who want to take part in us, so we need an inclusive territory where we can live in peace and prosperity. Let's also deal with migration, be courageous. This is the time to find practical solutions and consistent with our history, also in line with the standards of the civilization, which are only possible in this part of the world. Thank you. Mr. Kaminis.
So now we can hand over to Antonio Gomez Reino. I don't know whether he's in the auditorium. We'll be hearing from Mr. Karaminis at the end.
Merci.
Mr. Brescia from Italy. Thank you, President. There's no doubt that European Union, due to this migration crisis, we had the wrong response in terms of 2015. So it was a negative response in terms of the causes. It seems that we didn't understand to what extent the armed conflicts and armed conflict in the European Union had a responsibility. So we had to take in hundreds of thousands of migrants who landed on our borders. So it was a very conservative response, and we responded without the swiftness and determination that a crisis this crisis required. We had to condemn thousands of people for many years to live in those in countries without rights within the confines of Europe or in refugee camps within the European Union. But above all, it was dramatic in humanitarian terms. There are hundreds of thousands of people who have died in the Mediterranean. So this is a photograph, a snapshot, which shows us how, as societies and legislators, we can get it wrong. So in this point, we have seen. So this is the largest influx of migrants since the Second World War. So we need to condemn the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But this war should not allow us to ignore Lampedusa, the Sahel, and other areas of the world. So, of course, without wars, it's not that without wars we wouldn't have migrants, but the problem is that the war in Ukraine should not allow us to ignore other wars. There is also the climate change, and this will continue to push the peoples from the south towards the north. As we've already said today, as the Honourable Minister Minniti said, the war in Ukraine, if we don't do something about it, this will become an enormous food crisis for Africa. So in this sense, I think that the measures that have been taken for this crisis and Ukrainian refugees, this should allow us to this should push us to take similar measures in other contexts and for other conflicts. And regarding the migration, as we have also said, the civil society is forcing us to take in refugees, and we also have to make sure that the administrations do this in the correct way, so that we need an ambitious reform of the migration policy, and especially for the first-line countries. But the distribution, the unequal distribution of responsibility is one of the structural problems of our system. We need safe pathways towards the European Union, and we urgently need a new system of asylum which is just and efficient and also shows and respects solidarity.
Thank you very much. The Italian delegate, Mr. Brescia, and then we'll have Mr. Azubalis from the Lithuanian Parliament.
Thank you, President, for this opportunity to speak and to analyze the figures. We can see how the migration phenomenon is something which has already existed, and it will not cease to exist in the future. It will become even more serious in future years. We have to be able to provide an efficient response to such a complex phenomenon. As we know, there are two types of migrants who we'll call refugees or economic migrants, to keep it simple. So these require different responses, even if the limit between the two is not easy to distinguish. Wars, persecution, hunger, poverty, climate change force millions of people to look for better living conditions. Those people escaping from these situations will face any wars, any seas to reach their destination. But we need to provide the right responses to this. We need a good policy, and the first element here is to work on the causes and to fight as best we can against human trafficking. And then we have to manage efficiently the settlement of these refugees, so that it doesn't represent a problem, but so that it be an opportunity for the communities that host them and also for the immigrants. So it's necessary to state that these responses must be common responses. In order to do this, we need to overcome and change the Dublin Regulation, which forces the country of arrival to identify and to also deal with taking in these refugees. And allow me to say that this condition is extremely unjust, because it forces the border countries to take in hundreds of thousands of people in their territories, and essentially against their will. So how can we integrate somebody when it goes against or runs counter to our will? I want to take this idea further. The last proposal which was rejected, and that is that some of these first countries of arrival should be used as filter countries. So the European Union needs a united migration policy, and it needs to be the single countries who need to show humanitarian values, solidarity to these people. And this means taking in and having high quality conditions for and also providing legal pathways for these people. In Italy, this has meant we have taken in refugees, and this has been a strain on the public taste. We need to institute humanitarian corridors, but also quotas for those people looking for work. And finally, as the European Union, we should be able to reach bilateral agreements with countries of origin, countries of transit, and also be able to return people, assisted return. So the migration phenomenon is a global challenge, so we can only face this if we are able to bring together our forces, as we did during the pandemic and as we are doing for the crisis in Ukraine. We haven't chosen, so this is a challenge which we must win, because the consequence of failing in this endeavor would be too damaging for the whole of the continent. So I wish you all good work.
Merci, monsieur. Merci, monsieur.
Thank you very much.
Azubalis a la parole.
So Mr. Abuzalis has the floor, and then the next person from the Greek Parliament to take the floor.
Almost 1 year ago, Lithuania started experiencing an influx of irregular migration through Belarusian-Lithuanian border. This was the consequences of a Belarus policy to instrumentalize the migration for political purpose. As a result, the illegal crossing of the border increased almost 60 times in 2021. The hybrid attack against Lithuania and the EU organized by the Belarus regime led to thousands of arrivals to the EU member states. Migrants of 47 nationalities arrived to Lithuania illegally in 1 year, mostly from Africa and Middle East. What we've done, we used successfully EU Directive 2013/32, which allows member states to designate places where the asylum seekers could give their application. It means we stopped the illegal crossing through the borders. Now about another story. It's about Ukraine. Since the beginning of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, more than 52,000 people from Ukraine have been registered in Lithuania. About 20,000 of them are minors. More than 1,000 of them are unaccompanied persons, minors. By the ratio of persons who receive temporary protection and national population, Lithuania is a third in the EU after Poland and Czechia. Of course, it's a fat score. It's nothing to be proud of that, because the situation is really tragic. Dear colleagues, if I would like to compare these two influxes, a year ago from the Belarus border, from Middle East and Africa mostly, and present from Ukraine, we could find a very interesting demographic statistics. I would like to give it briefly. From Ukraine, among the refugees, 81% are females, and just 19% of males, mostly not working age or with some serious disease. From illegal migrants from Middle East and Africa, we see different picture. It means 72% consist of the working age males and just 28% of females. I think it's interesting to think why it's so, and even what's for me impressed mostly, that Ukrainians who are coming to Lithuania, they are not asking for welfare. They're asking for job places. And we're saying very simple way, give us a job, I want to work. And every third working age Ukrainian who is now in Lithuania is employed or self-employed. And by the way, believe or not, but they paid already in taxes more than 3 million euros to the state. I think we should think about it. And the last remark regarding new migration and asylum pact. Lithuania supports the idea of gradual approach proposed by the French presidency and look forward for first achievements in this regard. Important issues for Lithuania in this pact. Measures of reception, such as a relocation mechanism, should be simple and most importantly, voluntary. Relocation should apply only to the persons eligible for international protection. About Schengen border code. We welcome the Commission's proposal on the amendments of the Schengen border code, which is seen as a positive way forward to deal with emerging challenges when managing both the EU common external border and internal borders within the Schengen area. And important that the instrumentalization of migrants is defined, as well as the common standards of the EU border control are expanded. And the last, my remark goes to Mrs. Pivet. And I just want to quote her. She said that economic migration is also the source of our welfare. Of course it's yes. but it's also a challenge to our societies. Let's think about it. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Mr. Azubalis, and then it will be Sadavaris. Do forgive me. It is Mr. Sadavaris, do forgive me, and then we'll be hearing from Mrs. Alhedo Cesar. Please.
Gentlemen, the utterly reprehensible Russian invasion of Ukraine has unfortunately triggered the greatest refugee crisis in post-war Europe, also focusing public dialogue on the need for refugees flows, rapid and effective management. In the case of the Ukrainian crisis, the EU, for the first time since the Yugoslav civil war, has justly activated the international protection regime, which provides refugees with food, medical care, housing, and access to work. My country welcomes this immediate response. Having suffered the ongoing refugee crisis of previous years, Greece is particularly sensitive to these issues. What is more, as befits a country that since antiquity has highlighted the supplicant, that is the asylum seeker, as a holy person, but also as befits a people that has historically experienced the refugee notion, banished from ancestral homes, mainly in Pontus and Asia Minor, in the beginning of the previous century. Hence, from the very start, Greece has honored and implemented relevant EU decisions and already hosts in its territory more than 26,000 displaced Ukrainian citizens, while it has committed to hosting 500 Ukrainian refugees from Moldova, as well as to financially support Moldova for hosting Ukrainian refugees. In any case, this huge EU effort must not be undermined by any third party, instrumentalizing and using the migration issue for private gains and interests. Instead, the European Union should set up a diplomatic as well as an operational front to minimize the effects of strange third country policies, such as those of Turkey, which not only disregards its obligations to curb migratory flows and dismantle traffickers' networks operating in its territory, as set out in the 2016 EU-Turkey Joint Declaration, but also raises totally unsubstantiated complaints against Greece over alleged pushbacks to Turkey. These allegations certainly contravene our country's operational practices, which are always in line with the existing legal framework and with full respect for human rights. Thank you very much.
Merci,
Thank you very much. Before handing over to Mrs. Hedo Cesar, please keep to the 2 minutes 30 time limit, otherwise you won't have lunch. And we can't do without lunch, can we? Goodness me. Thank you very much. I hand over the floor.
Good morning, everybody, and I apologize for this mix-up. So what have we learned in 7 years? I don't think it's exactly what we should have learned. We just to think about the failed plan for resettlement, relocation, and this is a consequence of these 7 years. What have we learned in the meantime? Well, probably a lot less than what we should have learned. This is a transversal and a structural phenomenon. This requires an integral approach and response. We want a regular and ordered migration, but moreover, we need a migration policy which puts the person at the very center and also the respect of its dignity and rights. We need a global vision of things. We have policies that are based on the security of the borders, and which have been proved to be completely inefficient and which have led to the expulsion and difficulties. So we've tried to externalize our borders to third countries, which not only do they not respect human rights, but we need to do serious work in and with the countries of origin, improving the standard of living. Everybody would like to stay at home, but sometimes, because of necessity, we have to leave. So what we're defending is a policy which is based on solidarity and co-responsibility. I am from the Basque Country, and we're spread over France and Spain. We've always welcomed people, and I'm saying this because I think that there's been a mistake with migration policy. We have to highlight the role of those countries and of the governments, because those are the people that are responsible for integration and taking in refugees. My government has presented a proposal. This is based on responsible distribution of refugees, but at the same time, we have to be careful because people are not merchandise, and so this is not easy to distribute fairly these refugees. So some final reflections: the terrible situation of the Ukrainian people after the invasion. This requires full solidarity on our part and special efforts, but it shouldn't allow us to forget those other people who are arriving on our shores and who have also been here for some time. We cannot have policies which create discrimination between migrants, and we are running the risk of doing this. All rights should be equal for all people. Now, to say something positive, and in terms of Ukraine, we have showed how strong we are. A final issue: we cannot allow in Europe that xenophobia continues to rise. So in Castilian Spanish, so you cannot erect barriers, and we need to be mindful of this. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thanks very much. I hand over to Petra Steenen from the Netherlands. And then we'll be hearing from Mr. Ernst Godi from Austria. Thank you. Madam, you have the floor.
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thank you for your wonderful inspirational contributions to the colleagues. As the rapporteur for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe for the report on gender mainstreaming on migration policies, I believe in our work in the European Union we can learn from the work of the Council of Europe on migration policies. And in this I have 3 points I would like to share with you. Number one, we should take into account the needs of women and children who are seeking refuge. From protection against abuse by human traffickers, female hygienic products and safe sanitary conditions in refugee camps, but also to reproductive care, including access to safe and legal abortion. But also we should be enabling women to work and participate fully in our societies and not put them only in the position of the victim or the motherly role. And I am really impressed by our female colleagues from the Ukrainian parliament who call themselves the Women's Diplomatic Battalion. My second point is we tend to be more open and hospitable to receiving women and children, as we've seen recently in the case of Ukrainian displaced people. But young men and boys are entitled to the same compassion and humanitarian aid as well. I would like to recommend you to watch an award-winning documentary called Shadow Game, in which we can see how young men are sent by their families to seek a better life, and sometimes they really have to take enormous risk. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the statistics are different from the Ukraine and from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And thirdly, I think it's up to us, lawmakers, to take into account the diversity of people coming to Europe as migrants, as refugees, and displaced persons. We need data And we need to listen to the different voices of all genders, of all generations, and hear what their needs are. But we also need to look at the diversity and needs of our receiving communities to make the present solidarity among our own populations for people seeking protection from Ukraine and other countries not a short-lived sentiment, but a long-term basis for sustainable, compassionate migration policies. And Mr. Chair, allow me, I think we also need to be careful on our language. I'm from the Netherlands. We know fighting against water takes courage, but dealing with migration is not dealing with a natural phenomena. So let's be careful not to talk about floods and streams. We're talking about human beings. When we dehumanize people seeking protection, this might be one of the reasons why we talk about pushbacks as if we're fighting water and not allowing people to seek refuge in our societies. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gold. And then Mr. Stier from the Croatian Parliament.
Ja, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich danke den französischen Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Dear colleagues, thank you for the invitation to this very important conference. The subject of migration and asylum is also about the credibility of the European Union. When we look back on the year 2015, and I personally live on the border between Austria and Slovenia, so that back then I personally experienced the thousands of people coming in over the border daily. In Austria, there was a massive loss of control and loss of credibility, especially on the side of the authorities. We cannot repeat that. Thus, we need a systematic migration policy with a humanitarian face. In 2015, in Austria, there were 200,000 asylum applications. We are a small country with 9 million inhabitants, and we gave many of these people protection. But when we look over the last year, before the Ukraine crisis, then the pressure in Europe began increasing again. We had 630,000 applications for asylum. And of course, there are preferred countries, and Austria is one of the preferred countries of migrants. It's the second on the list, and on average, about 470 out of 100 were granted compared to the average in Europe, which is 180. So Austria is a destination country. Therefore, it's essential that we have a credible common migration policy. As the Senate President said today, we cannot have this situation where we have asylum à la carte. We need a consistent system within the EU and with a list of priorities. First priorities, local assistance. That means in regions where there are difficulties, for example, in Africa, we need more cooperation with countries of origin. And when we have refugees, what we need to do is try and accommodate many of them in the immediate vicinity of these countries, if possible. And that brings me to Ukraine crisis. Yes, we are a neighbour country. Of course, Austria doesn't have a border with Ukraine. Hungary is in between, but we still see ourselves as a neighbour, and that means that we have to provide support, and we do so. We have a directive on flows of refugees. We implemented the legislation necessary straight away so that the refugees have access to education, to the labour market, to health insurance, so that they can continue their lives as normal in Austria. This local assistance has to be our common goal, our top priority in providing assistance on the European level. It has to be based on ensuring we are credible.
Stier de Croatie.
So next we'll have Marina Nicolo from Cyprus.
Well, dear colleagues, let me start by expressing again our solidarity with Ukraine, as we have done in the Assemblée Nationale at the COSAC meeting last February. Coming from Croatia, let me also say that unfortunately we have, during our independence war, experienced the situation of having to take care of about 1 million refugees and internally displaced persons, either from Bosnia and Herzegovina or from the occupied territories in Croatia. Today we are not in the front line, but with the same spirit of solidarity we are, of course, receiving the Ukrainian refugees at this moment around 20,000. Now, we experienced also the migration crisis in 2015. What we learned since then? Well, first, that the Dublin Regulation is not working, so we certainly need a new pact on asylum and migration. Secondly, I think that we are now acknowledging much better the difference between refugees and economic migrants. And make no mistake about it, given our aging population and demographics, Europe needs also economic migration, but we need it in a legal way with legal instruments, not against our laws. Third, we learned that migration can be also used with a geopolitical purpose. It was not always evident, it was not always evident to all, but then we had the situation of the attitude of the Moroccan government vis-à-vis Spain, and then, of course, of the Lukashenko regime. And then I think that this gives a new light how to understand certain things that Mr. Erdogan was doing. So I think Europe should not be naive here. We are not, but we should take this into consideration. Now, I said in Croatia that we support the new pact on asylum and migration. I think that there's still some room for improvement, that not all of the burden is in the frontline states. I think that is important. Also in the return mechanisms and the agreements, not focusing only on the countries of origin, but also the transit countries. Especially for us, it's important, the Western Balkans, and that we reach an agreement also in particular with Bosnia and Herzegovina. Finally, let me say that in Croatia, we do not see a contradiction between the respect of international law, the respect of human rights, but also the security of our citizens and the security of our borders. And it's on this basis that we look forward to joining the Schengen area in order to assume our responsibilities in managing the external border of the European Union. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci. La parole est à Madame Marina Nicolo.
Marina Nicolo from Cyprus, and then Mr. Lint from the Parliamentary Assembly in Germany.
Dear colleagues, distinguished speakers, when there is a will, there is a way. This is the main lesson I have personally drawn regarding the refugee crisis in the light of the Ukraine war. For years, member states of the South, including Cyprus, have been calling for more solidarity in this policy area, as well as for more balanced responsibility sharing approach. The Republic of Cyprus has been strained to its capacity to manage massive influx of refugees and migrants. For the past years, Cyprus has been experiencing the unacceptable instrumentalization by Turkey of people seeking refugee for different reasons, thus increasing further the number of asylum seekers. In the recent years, the Republic of Cyprus has registered the highest number of asylum applications per capita in the entire European Union. The European response to refugee flows from Ukraine has been remarkable, both in speed and extent. We welcome the generous support both to Ukraine refugees and to host countries, as well as the activization for the first time of the Temporary Protection Directive as a token of solidarity to citizens fleeing war. However, we deplore the selective sensitivity shown depending on the origin of refugees, along with the fact that double standards apply when condemning violations of international law and human rights driving people away from their homeland. Dear colleagues, may I take this opportunity to remind you that Turkey has been blatantly violating violating my country's sovereignty rights since 1974, and the EU is appeasing the Erdogan's regime through the EU-Turkey joint statement. Dear colleagues, we call for more solidarity without exception towards those in need of protection, as well as towards member states in need of support. We urgently call for the adoption of a comprehensive migration and asylum pact, including a fair, sustainable, and permanent reallocation mechanism, ensuring no member state bears disproportionate burden of the Union's asylum policy, as opposed to the Dublin Regulation. The EU and its member states should invest much more in integration policies rather than in policies creating Fortress Europe, which have failed. The EU, including Frontex, must refrain from any policies tantamount to pushbacks which constitute a clear violation of human rights and fundamental rights. We should invest more in tackling the root causes of migration and refugee flows, including wars and armed conflicts, which are fueled also by the EU continuous race for armaments. This is why I firmly believe that with regard to the war in Ukraine in particular, the European Union should privilege the de-escalation of the conflict and diplomatic dialogue towards a negotiated agreement. Europe should become a player for peace and real development and humanitarian resolve in handling today's challenges and placing above other causes and dignity and prosperity of people, including, of course, migrants and refugees. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Madame. Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Helge Lind from the Parliamentary Assembly of Germany, then Mr. Rigaud from Belgium. Dear friends, humanitarian pragmatism is what we need. Please forgive me for speaking German. My English has a heavy accent, so I'll spare you that. First of all, the Geneva Convention cannot be simply a legislative measure. It must be applied. It cannot be an expression of charity. It has to be a way of enforcing the law. That means no pushbacks, fair asylum procedures. When we talk about push and pull factors, sometimes seems as if we're talking about refugees as some sort of mechanism, but these are people, regardless of what nationality, ethnicity, gender, etc. they have. Secondly, in crisis situations, it doesn't make sense to make asylum applications. That's why activating the temporary protection mechanism was smart and practical at the same time. Thirdly, when civil society plays its role, then things work better. Syria also showed us this. Then we can cope with high numbers of refugees. Fourthly, this is what we need to promote, civil society. For example, Portugal, in order to help, has promoted citizens welcoming refugees, but local communities, local councils need to be supported as well. Companies, unions also need to be involved to develop matching systems. Fifth point. Forced distribution doesn't work. History has shown us this. Sixthly, forced distribution doesn't work because refugees have to be involved. These are living people with their own ideas, their own interests, needs, feelings. Even when trying to be practical, we have to take that into account. So we have to take into account voluntary movements. And of course, if we look at Moldova, we see that it only works to a certain degree. So what are the conclusions? Well, we can't just let things be. We have to step up our efforts and do things better. We are seeing that Poland is taking 6 to 7% of the population, Moldova 3 to 4%. And my country, 0.1 to 0.7%, that is a lack of equilibrium, which isn't healthy in the long term. So we need innovative systems that incorporate civil society, the state, central government, local authorities. It has to be a combination of grassroots and central levels, and that has to be reflected on a European level. Thank you. Thank you. Now, Mr. Hervé Regaud, and then we'll have Mr. Stefan Schenach from Austria. Thank you. Drawing lessons from 2015, well, these are the questions we have to ask today. But it's difficult to believe. Yes, there are obvious statements to make. It's an uncertain world, perpetual crises, conflicts, and human beings are still moving, fleeing. Why? To have a better future. Maybe not even a better future, just any sort of future for them and their families. And second observation, all borders can be crossed. Of course, we are proud of having supported Ukrainian migrants with the temporary protection mechanism. But beyond that, what are we going to do? What are we doing for the other refugees that come from other regions? Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea. We've multiplied the resources for Frontex, but why the human rights are still being undermined such that the head of Frontex had to resign. And we have students that are stuck at the Ukrainian borders, and we have people dying in the Mediterranean. And even we have people's goods being destroyed when they run aground at Calais. So everyone seems to pass the buck to somebody else, and nobody can see the actual value in the migrants. In terms of legislative action, initiatives have been taken, yes, but there's a lack of guarantees to legal aid, and there's no obligation in the solidarity mechanisms. As a result of this, all over Europe, we have increasing populist and xenophobic discourse, and to respond to this, governments tend to attack migrants, and what we actually need to do is attack the smugglers and those who are really benefiting from this absolute underground economy of smuggling migrants. And the population is expressing its fears at the voting ballot. And the European Union has to turn the tide. Colleagues, we have to find solutions, not aiming to attack those who are moving, but those who are smuggling. We have to try and increase the legal crossings. It has to be a Europe based on solidarity that can move forward. We are constructing Europe together with a new migration pact. It needs to show solidarity to all those who are victims of atrocities, all those who are victims of atrocity, no matter where they come from. We need to have solidarity between different European countries. We can't hide behind Dublin, and we can't abandon the neighbouring countries either. We cannot accept that some people are rebuilding walls and pushing back migrants. In 2015, Angela Merkel showed that with courage and determination, we can do it. Wir schaffen das. We can do it. I firmly believe this. So let's be engaged. Let's have a humane, solid migration policy based on solidarity. And I think with hope, in the city of the Enlightenment and the city of Victor Hugo, whatever Paris recommends, Europe will continue. So let's do it. Thank you. Thank you for your information. Victor Hugo used to sit there. You will find a little commemorative plate to mark that. We'll have Mr. Schenach next, and then Mr. Bartulika from the Croatian Parliament. Mr. Schenach. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleague from Belgium for his wise and intelligent words, because in some speeches I've become slightly nervous. One thing is clear, neither United Nations nor Europe is differentiating between someone who comes from Aleppo or Mariupol. wherever they come from, the Geneva Convention says a refugee is a refugee. And the European Human Rights Convention says the same thing. So unaccompanied minors are unaccompanied minors wherever they come from, whether they come from Africa, from Pakistan, or from the Ukraine. So we need to be more sensible, and we need to apply the same standards. And the directive from 2001 activating that was very clever, because it helps people who are fleeing. They don't have to submit an asylum application. And in Europe, we have this situation that those who are asylum seekers, they are not allowed to work. So they don't have to become asylum seekers, and that means they have access to the labour market. That was an extremely clever and wise decision. As I'm sitting next to the Interior Minister of Italia, and Nora Mastrom has been supported by Portuguese ships, and this company actually saved lives. And it's a shame that we don't have Mare Nostrum anymore. I think the Mediterranean is where we show our humanity. Many countries that have lost people in the Mediterranean, they haven't deserved this. The Mediterranean shouldn't become a mass grave. We need to save people. We need to integrate people. This is one of the most important points. Frontex was criticized, and I can only underline this. It's scandalous that an institution of the European Union has carried out brutal, illegal pushbacks. That goes against all the conventions, and this has to lead to consequences, and has already led to consequences. And somebody mentioned we need corridors. What we have are refugees, migrants, and displaced persons. We have to be careful how we see these, because migration is something different to people who are fleeing. And fleeing is defined in the Geneva Convention. Since the Bosnia War, we have another definition: sexual violence, rape is a reason for fleeing. And as others said, there will be others added. Not being able to survive in your home country because of climate change will become another reason for fleeing. We already are accepting the first climate refugees in New Zealand and Australia. So in this spirit, it's good what we're doing. We need a new Dublin regulation. It wasn't created to master the challenges that we face today, and we need to get back to Schengen. We need open borders in Europe, and we certainly don't need the measures that we see, including from my country, again and again. We need mobility in Europe, freedom of movement, but also intellectual freedom as guaranteed by Erasmus. That's solidarity in Europe. Thank you. Now I would give the floor to Mr. Bartulika and then Mr. Aspling. Mr. Bartulika.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, it's a great honor for me to be able to address this distinguished body. I want to thank our French hosts for organizing this important interparliamentary conference. First, I would like to underscore what my colleague Davor Stier earlier said about Croatia's contribution to this important issue. In the 90s, as he mentioned, we received nearly 1 million refugees and cared for them who came from Bosnia and Herzegovina at a time when our country itself was occupied. A third of our territory was under occupation. And we're expressing the same solidarity today with Ukraine, of course. Up till now, about 20,000 Ukrainians have sought refuge in Croatia. We quickly passed legislation to enable them to enter into the health and social system of our country. But I think it's important today to again emphasize the distinction between wartime displaced persons or refugees and economic migrants. And the question then is what is prudent for each of our countries. We know we have limited resources, the EU included. We have to face this challenge with this principle of prudence in mind. And regardless of what our own worldview may be, I think experience shows that we must take religion seriously as a strong force in motivating human behavior. As I said, regardless of what our own personal worldview may be. And the experience shows in many EU countries the experiment with integration of large numbers of migrants has largely failed. It's been very difficult, that's no secret, and I think this needs more attention. This question demands more attention and honest debate, sober debate in our parliaments. Finally, on the question of human rights, I just want to make a principled point that for me, human rights, basic fundamental human rights includes rights for unborn children. Thank you very much.
Merci à vous. Monsieur,
Thank you. Mr. Aspling from Sweden, and then Ms. Fernandez from the Republic in Portugal.
Let's talk a little bit about the basic ethical aspect of EU migration law and the irregular inflows of migrants from Africa and the Middle East. When we talk about this, we often discuss it in terms of a moral good, and that is the option to apply for asylum here in the European Union. In contrast to an economic and social reality, we all know that large-scale migration from culturally distant places cause a lot of problems. This is no secret. But is this an accurate way of thinking about the problem? No, I don't think so. First of all, as long as you need to get here illegally to actually apply for asylum, the option to do so is of no help at all to the vast, vast majority of all the people who would wish to come here. Second of all, what the EU is doing right now is basically holding up one stack of banknotes in one hand and telling poor people around the world that if you empty your bank accounts and you buy a ticket with a local organized crime group and you actually make it here alive, then this stack of banknotes can be yours. But the EU is also holding up another stack of banknotes in the other hand for financing border guards in northern Africa, questionable policing operations, including the deal with Turkey, to stop those same migrants from actually making it here. For anyone with a working moral compass, this is not just wrong, it's sick. We're playing a game with people's lives, and it needs to stop. And on top of that, of course, those same mafia groups that profit a lot from the smuggling of migrants, they use the profits to destabilize communities, which makes more people want to leave, which makes even greater profits, and so on and so on. And I'm sure everyone here remembers that one of the major sources of revenue from for the Islamic State, for example, was smuggling of migrants. This system also debilitates the Union's diplomatic efforts, as we know. The deal we struck with Turkey is a very clear example. Obviously, the system as it stands right now causes more problems than it solves, and it needs to be rehauled completely. Obviously, people, the moral thing to do here is to either waive the visa requirement and let everyone who wants to claim asylum by plane in a safe and legal way, but we know this would be the end of Europe as we know it, so we're not going to do that. Or cancel the option to apply for asylum here in the European Union, which would end this deadly cats and mouse game once and for all. Obviously, the only way forward here is to follow the example of the United Kingdom and Denmark and start the process of outsourcing the whole asylum process to safe third countries. We're obviously still going to accept asylum claims and process them in accordance with international law, but just not here. We need to deal with the economic incentive for irregular migration to the European Union. All the problems that we're talking about here today comes down to this one point. That is a circle that we cannot square in any other way. Thank you.
Merci, cher collègue. Madame
Thank you. Ms. Fernandez from the Assembly in Portugal. And then we'll have Thomas Kivimägi from Estonia.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames, Messieurs, c'est un honneur pour moi.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, thank you. It's an honor for me to speak in front of this venerable assembly. The Portugal Assembly congratulates the European Union for the rapidity with which it decided unanimously on the 4th of March to activate the temporary protection mechanism faced with the massive flow of refugees from Ukraine. The Portuguese government, within the framework of national legislation, has implemented the directive of July 2001. From the 1st of March, came up with a resolution to define the specific criteria for implementing temporary protection for those displaced from Ukraine, those fleeing the Russian offensive from 24th of February. This mechanism for welcoming refugees has allowed us to have a simplified and rapid implementation so that the refugees have all the documents necessary, giving them access to many fundamental rights, such as full access to medical care, public services, education, Portuguese language courses, and integration into the labour market. At the moment, there are about 306,000 applications for temporary protection. Most of these are women. 30% are children, those under 18, and 61% are able to work. And the Border Management Department managed to create a platform to manage online applications for temporary protection. In a very short space of time, we were able to put in place an accelerated service which allows us to achieve very good results, and there is no reason why we can't manage to integrate other refugees and displaced persons, whether they're from Syria, Nigeria, or other countries. They all deserve the same humane treatment. I've just quoted the Portuguese Interior Affairs Minister. So we wish that the ability to apply the agreements and the principle of solidarity is obligatory and flexible and enables us to confront the problems that we face in terms of migration and refugees. And once again, we believe that we have to put in place a global pact for migration, for regular migration, and this should be applied in the different countries. For example, Portugal has already implemented many of these measures. Thank you. Mr. Kivimaji and then Mr. Markus Leinfellner.
Je vous en prie.
Bonjour, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers collègues. Estonia has given shelter to nearly 38,000 refugees from Ukraine. This is 2.9% of our population. And to better understand the proportions, this would equal to France giving shelter to 1.9 million refugees. But despite the big challenges we are facing, Estonia still doesn't support mandatory quotas for refugees in the EU, as it was mentioned by the previous speakers. We find that it's better for refugees, if possible, to stay in the neighboring or close geographically countries and not to flee thousands of kilometers from their homeland. Most of them are planning to return to Ukraine after war. Besides, Estonia has 300,000 permanently residing Russian-speaking people in Estonia. And before the next phase of a war in Ukraine, we already had about 25,000 Ukrainians residing in Estonia under short-time working permits. So all in all, it is easier for Ukrainian refugees to settle down for a while in the neighboring or geographically close countries. I find it is very human to let refugees to choose the country where to stay in this tragic time. But supporting this very human principle, we are expecting the EU to take a bigger role in compensating for part of the costs of the EU states that have accepted more refugees than average. Dear colleagues, we have to keep in mind, Ukraine is fighting for a freedom in Europe. Ukraine doesn't owe to EU. EU and its member states does owe to Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Merci. La parole est à Monsieur Marcus.
Thank you. Mr. Markus Leinfeldner has the floor, and then Julien Ropal from Germany. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I come from the Steiermark region. I'm a military policeman, and I worked at the border crossings in 2015, and I can say that people who really need help, they're different. People who need our help, they also look different, and gratitude also is different to what I saw there. And the first part of today's discussion is about the lessons we learned from 2015 against the backdrop of the Ukraine war. And I must say that these two things cannot be lumped together because there is one key difference. The migration crisis in 2015-16 concerned 2.6 million people who were fleeing and seen as refugees within the framework of the Geneva Convention and thus were given asylum status, or not when there was no longer war, or if they were no longer being persecuted for religious or other reasons. But the people who are fleeing Ukraine don't fall under the same definition. The Geneva Refugee Convention doesn't recognize war. They fall under the Temporary Protection Directive, which is being applied for the first time and which offers protection for a maximum of 3 years. And I know you're all aware of this. These people have access to the labour market on an unlimited basis, and this is correct. So we cannot mix up the two situations. There's one thing they have in common. That is, they need protection, asylum, but these are temporary things. If the reason for fleeing no longer exists, then the people have to leave the EU again. Let's help these people, but let's not forget the legal side of things. Thank you very much.
Merci, cher collègue. Monsieur Julien Pal.
Julien Pal, where's he? There he is.
Et ensuite,
and then
Monsieur Kaminis.
Mr. Keminis.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Ukraine and the war against Ukraine has shown what our European Union is capable of. Keep the borders open, externally as well as internally, and create a system of distribution. And we're proving right now what our European Union is capable of and what it stands for. Not just economic prosperity, but also our basis, the human rights. The European Union was funded as a radical consequence after the horrors of the Second World War. And today, these fundamental rights and this heritage is in danger. We need to adopt and apply the solidarity that we are proving to the people coming from the Ukraine. But what would our European Union look like then? Maybe instead of funding so-called Coast Guard or illegally pushback people on the move, we should guarantee the fundamental right of claiming asylum, as we did with the millions of Ukrainians. And we need to create a system of solidarity, where then people on the move are distributed to those countries that want to be a safe port. What we have achieved for the people from Ukraine is historic and is what this European Union makes. But I've been on the Mediterranean, on the civil rescue ship Juventa. With many volunteers, we've rescued 14,000 people from drowning, but I've also seen with my own eyes how people on the move have vanished and have drowned in the Mediterranean. We must overcome this bias with which people on the move are treated, with which people are left to vanish in the Mediterranean or are left to rotten on the Aegean Islands. Instead, look at the unity and the uncompromised reaction to the movement from Ukraine, and this is what our European Union should stand for: the protection of human rights and everyone's dignity. And this must be our common goal as Europeans, to leave no one behind. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks very much. Last speaker, Mr. Kaminis from the Greek Parliament. You have the floor, sir.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you very much.
7 years after the 2015 crisis, Europe is faced once more with a major humanitarian challenge on its external borders. And this realization is a vindication of what Greece and other countries on the European periphery have been saying for the last 10 years at least, even before the 2015 crisis. My country did not shy away from its responsibility and stepped up in solidarity with the member states who are geographically and culturally placed at the epicenter of this crisis. This is exactly the kind of attitude all member states need to adopt in future refugee crises. So lesson number one, much like climate change, migration is a European cross-border challenge and can only have European-wide solutions. However, this newfound sense of solidarity needs to be formally and legally reflected in the final proposals of the new European Migration and Asylum Pact. We still feel that its provisions do not strike the correct balance between solidarity and responsibility. What the refugee crisis of 2015, but also the events on the river Evros in our northern border with Turkey in 2020 have shown is that Europe should cooperate, but not rely on third countries to manage its migration challenges. So lesson number two, anointing Turkey as a privileged partner and ultimate arbiter of European migration policy, especially with the 2016 joint statement, was a mistake. Russia and Belarus in the east and Morocco in the southwest are taking their cues from the way Turkey has behaved. As long as Europe seems terrified at the prospect of hosting refugees and doing proper integration work, these countries will take advantage of this weakness. So lesson number three, no actor alone can effectively manage the challenge. Not countries, not the EU, not the UN or the OECD, not civil society. We need all of us to act together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Merci, chers collègues.
Thank you very much. All right, so we've reached the end of our 28th statement. I don't know whether Mrs. Perrat or Mr. Miniti would like to add additional comments, but we have an answer. Mrs. Perrat, and then your colleague. You can speak from that position. You have the floor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your respective statements. which reflect, as I would say, your national positions, but also your political hailings. Plus, one or two clarifications in respect to Ukraine. As a reminder, the temporary protection is an answer which makes it possible to provide equivalent positions, asylum-wise, in a very swift fashion, because there's pretty much no procedure to accomplish. So this enables the beneficiary, who are refugees fleeing a conflict. Lots of comparisons have been made between 2015 and today. But it's quite clear that there are similarities between those situations, because in 2015 there were people fleeing the Syrian conflict in mixed flows. But of course, there were many Syrian refugees who were fleeing the conflict, just as the Ukrainians today. Also, another reminder, I made mention swiftly of the Solidarity platform. We're endeavoring to establish a joint register to record temporary protection as a source of reassurance, reassuring the fact that people can be tracked properly. Mrs. Chapa, Madam Minister, spoke of human smuggling, human trafficking, and the number of women who are afflicted by such a trade, a vast majority of women and children. Now, we've just set up and validated an action plan to combat trafficking. This is designed to raise awareness among all our member states and civil societies. You made mention of these, who are particularly active in managing the crisis. And this designed to track very closely and stringently the movements of these women, and in particular children, to immediately identify situations that could be described as human trafficking and kidnapping. All right, so this is something that we're very mindful of. And obviously, we also want to avoid having a system of double-upping of temporary protection in countries. It should be ready at the end of May. It's a vast amount of work to set up this IT tool, put it together in a space of a few weeks. This is part of the numerous tasks that we are grappling with, but I have every hope that this situation and this procedure will be available between now and the end of the month. Now, what about financial support? Financial support came up regularly. Right from the outset, we've tried to make available a number of monies. Of course, I know that for most of you, this isn't enough because it's obviously within the EU's budget. Within those confines, unfortunately, we can't give more than we receive, so we're trying to do the best we can to provide greater flexibility in the use of the structural funds, which, after all, which is a deep pocket of financial contributions. And to that extent, a reminder, every beneficiary of temporary protection de facto benefits from the regional European funds, the cohesion funds and the social fund. And the last point, going to the matter of support under the banner of the funds, and for my part, the fund for asylum and migration. We're making available 400 million euros. I know it's a bit of a drop in the ocean, but this is what we can do at a moment's notice for the frontline countries. And in the next few weeks, we'll be making available first tranche of this money for the beneficiary countries. And then after that, countries that are particularly afflicted, Estonia springs to mind for a second tranche. I'd also like to round off by paying my thanks, my warm thanks, to the frontline countries. The representative of the Czech Republic mentioned this. I was in that country only last week, and I was able to see with my own eyes what's being done in your country. Similarly in Poland, similarly in Romania, where, we are showing great support also to Moldavia, because we're fully mindful of the fact that Moldavia is the weak link, if you will, in this whole apparatus. So huge support will be offered to Moldavia. My commissaire was there only last week to help that country as best as possible. We'll be stepping up our support, going to the fight of weapons trafficking. We haven't talked about security very much, but this is a very important point. Every military weapon that's going off into Ukraine, we don't really know what it will come after that. So this is, again, something that we'd list to work on. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rapporteur General. Mr. Muniti, if you wish to take the floor, you may do so now.
No, molto brevemente.
Very briefly then, I think that this discussion has shown one thing which is extremely important, and that is that it's clear that there are different positions in the different countries, but there is nevertheless a common feeling and that we have arrived at. And it's not easy to arrive at that result. It's very important because we have challenges which are particularly complex ahead of us. And I'd thank, and I will continue to thank, those people who have taken in and shown extraordinary solidarity with the refugees from Ukraine. I know that some countries have made exceptional efforts to take in these people. And I would like us to be at the end of this crisis, but I fear that we are not at that point yet. And it is clear. That is quite clear. We may be facing a very long war within the heart of Europe, and a long war in an interconnected world that can have also many effects, and many effects far away from the battlefield. So one of those fields may be the Mediterranean, Northern African countries, and so I would like to say here that in terms of these issues, we must move forward. We need to face immediately the looming food crisis, and we need to free up the grain which is being blocked in Ukraine. And if we can't do that, we have to find other forms of compensation. So, because there may be, if this grain is lacking, then there may be severe social tensions in North Africa. And so and finally, I see that the solidarity system in Europe has provided fruit. So in the past, we had Italy, Germany, others, and in Italy, we've taken in 120,000 refugees. But we must be careful, nevertheless, because if there is a major flow of migrants from Africa, this principle of solidarity may be brought into, may be challenged. So I am trying to be as sincere as possible. And I wouldn't be sincere if I didn't tell you that I am worried, and this is why we must proceed and deal with two particular issues while waiting for Dublin to be changed, and that must be changed. We have to start today, and I do insist on this today. We need to come up with a compact which should be discussed with the countries of Northern Africa, and that should be done now. Europe has provided 6 billion euros to Turkey in 2 different tranches. Would it be possible to think of even a smaller sum, but nevertheless a significant sum of money for Northern Africa? Why isn't that possible? Why is it possible to discuss? And I agree with Turkey, but why can't we discuss with Morocco and Tunisia or Libya even? So this is what Europe needs to do, because no country can do this on its own. France can't do this, Germany can't do this, Italy can't do it. So even the first-line countries cannot do that. This is the challenge for the coming months. I'm not talking about the coming years, but the coming months. And let's get used to this very simple mechanism. So facing these difficult situations, we are used to reacting to those. So in some cases, we act timely, but in other cases, we act in a more tardy manner. So, but Europe is in a state of war, and so slowness is just not an option. So So I hope that I have been clear with you, and I'm sorry if I have been impertinent. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre. Merci.
Thank you very much, Minister. Well, we've come to the end of our first session, and in a few minutes I will close the session, and I would ask you to meet us at the staircase of honor, which is just on the right, so that we can take a group photo, a family photo, if you allow me, before we come back after lunch. So thank you. See you in a moment.